Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about this in just a moment with Professor Steven Friedman. He's at Political Studies at the University of Johannesburg. We're going to look at some of those things that were brought up by the cross-examination State Security Agency, including its running under Minister Ayanda Dlodlo's. What are the tough questions that the president faced? And we're going to, if we can, let's just, in fact, look back at some of the questions posed to him and how the president responded.
The events of the state security saga over a period from 2007 to now, not 2 years ago, not 1 year ago, but to now, could hardly be termed a lapse, Mr. President. They were a concerted exercise of state governance and executive control. These weren't mistakes. These weren't slip-ups. Minister Dlodlo didn't arrive one morning and say, oops, I forgot to do this, or I made a mistake. This was a deliberate pattern of misgovernment, which has possibly had the most serious consequences for our state.
Professor Steven Friedman with Political Studies at the University of Johannesburg joins us now. Professor Friedman, so just reflecting on that particular excerpt of the questioning of the president on the running of the State Security Agency, especially what was called executive control and governance. What are your thoughts about it, especially how he brought it back to where we are now? Was he taking enough responsibility from the period 2007 up until now was actually under review in this question?
Good afternoon, Tsepiso. No, I don't think that he did take enough responsibility, and I think that the evidence leader was right to pursue the issue in the way he did. I certainly think that the idea that his failure to act is the reason why we had violence recently, which has been implied. I think that's way over the top. And I think that repeats a South African habit of blaming very deep-rooted problems on one or two individuals. Quite clearly, he should have acted against the minister. He should have acted against Mr. Fraser. He should have acted against Mr. Mshlobo. But I think it's very naive to believe that if you get those three people out of the way, we could have avoided what happened a few weeks ago. But obviously, it's very important that the president is held to account for this, because it's clearly an example of a case where his caution, which very often works for him and works for government, actually worked against him and worked against the interests of the country.
And we'll talk about caution vis-a-vis discretion, especially when he makes appointments, in just a moment. But the fact that the president ended his appearance by saying that he surprised many of his contemporaries by willing to testify before the commission, and yet he appeared to answer "I don't know" several times today, to yesterday's "I don't recall," as you pointed out. And it's also been said that in a period of 5 years, he spoke out only twice against state capture. As you mentioned, only certain individuals have had a finger pointed at them for, taking accountability on state capture. From the optics, what light does it put him under these "I don't knows," "I don't recalls," etc., etc.?
Well, in fairness to him, I think the "don't knows" and "I don't recall" are fairly slight compared to those of his predecessor when he was prepared to be there. He's trying to make the point that he wasn't everywhere during the Zuma administration. I really think that we need to distinguish here between the evidence about the period when he was deputy president and the period where he was president. He has a coherent position on the period when he was deputy president, and that coherent position is that he and others who felt like him decided that if they left, things would be far worse than if they stayed. And quite frankly, it's a very powerful argument. You could make a very strong argument which says that if Mr. Ramaphosa and his allies had left government, Brian Molefe would be Minister of Finance, and the country would long since have been in effect sold to a very small group of people. That by staying within there, they were able to prevent various things happening and bring us to the situation we're in now. But the question of since he became president is an entirely different matter. I mean, obviously, the highlight or low light, whichever way you want to look at it, is this SASA issue, which is obviously a very important issue. There's also his response to the question of deployment, which I think certainly raises some controversial issues. So, you know, to me, this idea that we're going to spend the next 10 years kind of hand-wringing about whether his strategy was right or the strategy of resigning was right is not going to bring the country very much further.
Okay.
I think shining a spotlight on issues like the SASA issue is certainly going to take the country further.
So, Prof, you say that we must make a distinction. I want us then to just cast an eye to this exchange, especially on David Mahlobo. Okay, so some may have considered him evasive on responding to the question on why he appointed David Mahlobo despite findings against him. The president refused to answer on the basis that he was awaiting a final report. Let's just take a quick look.
The high-level review panel, which was released in redacted form by your office in March 2019, as I understand it, made serious findings, albeit on the basis of reports made to it in relation to Minister Mahlobo. You appointed him as a deputy minister in May 2019, despite the findings of the high-level review. Now, that can't have been a mistake or lapse. That was a deliberate decision on your part. What is the explanation for that?
And in this regard, I have, as I said in my statement, been saying I want to wait for the outcome of the Commission's report. And I think that's about all I can say on that question right now.
But as I try to emphasize, Mr. President, the question is whether he's a suitable person for appointment in the first place. And that doesn't need a firm judgment of a court or a commission to assist. It doesn't explain why state security being as important as it was, Mr. Mahlobo involvement and allegations against him, why he was still a suitable person for appointment to cabinet. And we'll come to this issue later, but is the explanation not it's a matter of balance and power in politics?
Mr. Chairperson, I'm waiting for the Commission's report in this regard to be able to make my judgment.
Well, sadly, we'll come back to the issue because it's a central part of your explanation for the events.
So, Professor Friedman, I'd like to hear from you. So you are saying it's important to make that distinction, but it also is important for us to understand what is involved in the decision-making process, where he relies on his discretion and where he would rely on, long, drawn-out, meticulous reports that are given to him to make a decision.
Look, the proverbial bottom line, Piso, is, as Advocate Pretorius said, accurately, it was a reading of the balance of power at that particular time. Some of us would argue that it was a misreading of the balance of power. And that's what I meant by caution earlier. The president, because of the manner in which he was elected, you remember 147 votes or thereabout, I think it was, a National Executive Committee split just about equally between the two factions. He took the view that he had to conciliate the other faction rather than alienate them. And at times, he did this incredibly effectively. He managed to maneuver himself into a position where, without alienating the other side, all the important cabinet posts were held by his people, and none of them were held by the other side. They all held the less important posts. But he didn't always get it right. And this is obviously a case in which he was overcautious, in which he clearly should have acted and he didn't. And it was because of his particular reading of the balance of power. It was because of his belief that his strength in the ANC is his ability to project himself as the candidate of unity rather than the candidate of disunity.
Thank you so much.
And that had very negative consequences in this case. I think Mr. Pretorius is absolutely right about that.
Thank you so much for your time, as always, and your insights. Professor Steven Friedman, Political Studies at the University of Johannesburg, just wrapping up day 2 of President Cyril Ramaphosa's appearance at the State Capture Commission as it wraps up its work.